Welcome to the 9th video in this tutorial series on building an e-commerce website using React, Redux, GraphQL, and Firebase. Now in today's video, we're going to be looking at Redux Saga. Well, Redux Saga is an alternative to using something like Thunk Middleware because it allows you to handle the asynchronous code within your React Redux ecosystem. Now, typically, a Redux action creator is just a function returns an object with typically a type and a payload that will eventually be used to update your Redux store. Now, Thunk Middleware allows you to write asynchronous actions. So you can basically fetch data from an API within your action before you actually update your Redux store. Now, what Redux Saga does is it allows you to take all of that asynchronous code out of your action creators, and it will actually intercept actions that you tell it to. It will call a generator function that can handle those asynchronous events, and then it will dispatch another action to actually go ahead and update your Redux store. Before we get started, I just want to ask you guys to subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can find it at youtube.com/simpletut. But I also want to ask you guys to check out the playlist that I'm creating for this series. So I'm going to be posting a link to all of these pages in the description of this video. But as I'm creating these videos, I'm adding all of them to this playlist. Of course, I also want to let you guys know that there is an official GitHub repository for this project. At the end of each of these videos, I'm creating PRs, I'm merging my code with master, so you guys can come here, you can check out the code that I'm writing. Maybe you just want to clone the project. But again, I'd like to ask you guys to fork the project. Of course, I also want to let you guys know our official website, that's simpletut.com. But of course, the most important thing is please do subscribe, like, and comment on my videos. I do read your comments and they do guide me in the content that I produce going forward. Before we can use Saga middleware in our application, we need to install it and pass it to our store. To do that, all we need to do is head over to our terminal and install the library. So I'm going to do npm install Redux Saga, hit return, and it's going to install the dependency. Once that's installed, I'm just going to restart the application. So npm run start. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is actually pass the Redux Saga middleware to our Redux store so that we can use it in our application. To do that, I'm going to go into my create store file, which is in the source directory redux create store.js. And we need to first of all import Redux Saga itself. The name I'm going to assign it is going to be create Saga middleware, and I'll explain why in just a second. So we're going to import that from Redux Saga. And we need to first of all create an instance of the Saga middleware before we can pass it into our middleware's array. So to do that, I'm going to create a const called Saga middleware. And all it's going to equal is this create Saga middleware, but we're going to call that as a function. We'll then be able to pass that into our middleware's array, which will eventually be passed into our apply middleware function, which is used in our create store function when we create our store on runtime. Now, just after where we call create store, and it's very important that this comes after where we make that call, we need to then call a method on our Saga middleware, which eventually we're going to use and pass our root Saga into. Now, currently, we don't have any sagas. We also don't have a root Saga, but the way that this will work is very similar to how we currently have our root reducer. So we use our root reducer to combine all of our reducers. And we're going to do the same thing with our sagas. So within the Redux folder, I'm going to create a new file called root.saga.js. And at the top of this file, we're going to import some effects from the Redux Saga library. So we're going to say Redux Saga /effects. And the two effects we're going to import are going to be the all effect and call. Okay, so the difference between these two is that all allows us to resolve effects in parallel, similar to promise.all, and call allows us to call functions. Okay, so now we need to create our first generator function. To do that, we're going to say export default, and we're going to create our first generator function. To do that, use the function keyword followed by an asterisk, followed by the name of this function, which is going to be root saga. Then we'll be able to use the yield keyword followed by all, which will allow us to pass it an array where we can eventually pass it our sagas. Now, of course, at the moment, we don't have any sagas to pass in here, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but we're going to come back over now to our create store function, because that is enough for us to actually import and pass into our run method. So at this point, I'm going to just import my root saga, and I'm going to do that after my root reducer. It actually doesn't matter where I import this, but for me this just makes more sense. And I'm just going to import this, of course, from the file I just created, which is my root saga.js, and we'll simply pass that into our run method. Okay, so the first component that we're going to be refactoring is our sign in component. So let's go ahead and make a start. Now, to do that, I'm going to head over to my text editor, and the first file that we need to look at is in our user folder within Redux, and it's our user actions and our user types. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to create some space at the top of our actions file, because we need to create two new actions. But before I do that, I need to create a new type, which I'm going to explain more about as we move through the tutorial. But for now, let's just create the type we need, which is going to be email sign in start. And the value here is going to be the name of the key. And we're also going to move the sign in success to the top. So what I'm doing here is we're going to be doing a lot of refactoring here. We may, use some of these. We may not. We may create new ones. But the ones at the top here are the ones we're going to be using, at least, right now. Let's go back over into our actions file. And we want to use those two types now. So we need to create two new actions. So we're going to export const. The first one is going to be email sign in start. It's going to take the user credentials, and it's just going to return an object because it's just a simple action now, which is going to have a type, which is going to be user types, which we're importing above already. .email sign in start, and the payload here is going to be the user credentials. The next action we need to create is just going to be a success action. So it's just going to be sign in success. And again, that's just going to take the user here and return an action. So this one is just going to have type of user types dot sign in success with a payload of the user that's returned from the Firebase auth library. Now, you might be wondering why I've included this start keyword here. Well, it's a naming convention used within Redux Saga. And to understand why, you'd have to understand how Redux Saga works. But I'd rather show you than try to explain it. I think it would be a little bit boring if I just end up talking too much in this tutorial. I'd rather do more coding. So within the user folder here, within Redux, I'm creating a new file called user sagas. I think it's clear already what this file will contain. It's our user sagas. And this is what we're going to import into our root saga. But before we can actually create any of our generator functions, we need to import a few things. So the first is going to be our user types. which we'll import from our types file. So we have user types here. We need some things from Redux Saga itself. So we'll import from Redux Saga effects, and we need a few effects. So we need take latest, which I'll talk about in a second. We need call and all. You guys already know about that. And we need put. So take latest is actually, I'll explain that in just a second. The other thing we need to do here is we need to import one of our actions, which is going to be our sign in success action here. So we're now ready to write our first generator function. So what we'll do is we'll just say export function with, and the way you do that is just say function with an asterisk after the function keyword, and that creates a generator function. And we need to give it a name. I'm going to call it on email sign in start. And we're going to just yield take latest, which expects two things. The first is the action that we're listening for. To specify that, we'll just say user types, which we're importing up here, and the name of the type that we're going to be listening for, which is email sign in start. And the second thing that it expects is the name of a generator function that will handle this event when it is called, and it does intercept this action. And we're going to call that email sign in. We haven't created that yet, so let's go ahead and create that above. We'll do that by saying export function. It's a generator function. We'll say email sign in, and this is going to actually receive the entire action. But we don't need all of the contents of it. All we need is the payload. So we'll destructure the payload from the action. And from the payload, we're going to destructure the user's email and password, which is what we're going to use to sign them in. Okay. Now, although we've written our first Saga, and yes, we haven't written any code within our within this function to handle the event, but we will. But the Redux store hasn't been provided our sagas. So to do that, we need to export it first. So I'm going to say export default here. And I'm just going to export this as, it will be another generator function, but it's going to be called my user sagas. And all we do here is we'll say yield, and we say all, which accepts an array where we will call the our sagas. So the only saga here we need to pass is our on email sign in start, because once this is called, it will actually call the email sign in for us. So we don't need to pass both. We only need to pass in this start generator function. But we need to then import this into our root reducer. So within my root root saga. So within my root saga file, I'm going to import that user sagas from the file I created, which is in the user folder, user sagas, and then I can then use call here and pass my user sagas. And of course, as you guys know, we have our root saga, which is imported in create store, and that is passed to this run method here, which is where we pass our sagas to our Redux store. And now we're ready to actually handle signing in the user, right? Now currently, if we look at our component, which is our sign in component here, we have our form, which when submitted calls this handle submit function, which dispatches our sign in action, right? Now, of course, we don't want to use this action anymore, but we do want to take the contents of the action, which is this try catch, and I'm going to move that logic into my Redux Saga. Now, of course, this isn't going to work in this way. We'll have to refactor it. But before I do that, I'm going to come back over to my sign in component. And rather than importing this sign in user action, I'm going to import my email sign in start action, which is what I'm going to dispatch here with the user's credentials, which is the email and password. So if we look at this action here, again, it just takes the user credentials and passes it in the payload of the action object, the action object, which is then intercepted by my Redux Saga, which is listening for this action, which then calls my email sign-in generator function, where we will destructure off the email and password. We then enter this try catch, right? And what we want to do here is actually think about just going through these lines and slowly refactoring them. So rather than this await keyword, we just say we want to yield this. We are not importing this auth library, right? So if I just come over to the actions, I know I'm going to need all of these. So I'm going to import all of these from my Firebase utility file. Now, if you're not familiar with that, then what this is this is my Firebase utility file. We created this in one of the first videos of this tutorial series. And in this file, we have a few helper functions. We also just export certain things from our Firebase auth library, including auth. And this is, just things that we can use throughout the application to make things easier. So I'm just going to import that into the file because, of course, here we're using it, so we need to import it. And finally, on this line, we are dispatching a success event. And this is just, it's not going to work, right? We can't dispatch an action in this way from our Redux Saga. So the way we do that is we use this put effect. So we'll just say yield put, we'll call that and pass it our sign in success action. But before we actually go any further with that, I'm going to comment this line out because we're not actually going to be using it, right, just yet. So I'm going to delete this code here. And we're pretty much ready at this point to test this out in the browser, all right? So it's not going to be working 100%, but we're at a point where we can kind of test this. So I'm going to go to the browser. This is my login page, and I'm going to sign into a test account. So I'm just going to say Joe Blogs, which is a test account I have set up previously at Outlook, and this is the password. Let's sign in. So you can see we're signed into the application. We're not redirected. We need to dispatch that success event to actually redirect us, but we are signed into the application. You can see the header here is updated. I can go to my account page, I can go back to the home page. But we do have a problem, and to explain that problem, I'm going to come back to the browser, and what I want to talk to you about is what we're doing on this line here. Right, so on this line, we are not actually updating the Redux store. We're signing the user in, but we're not updating the Redux store with the user information, which would sign them into our application ultimately, right? So how is that happening? Well, to answer the question, we need to look at app.js and what we're doing inside of this React hook, which is the useEffect hook here. So useEffect works in the same way as component did mount, and also what this returns is going to work the same way as component will unmount. We unsubscribe here. But what we're doing here is we're subscribing using an event listener. And this, again, runs whenever our application is, whenever this component's mounted, when we initially run our application, when the user visits our website. We create an event listener and we subscribe to the Firebase auth library to determine whether the user is signed into our application or not. And this is where we actually dispatch an action to update our Redux store. Now the problem is, if we were to comment this code out here, return to the browser, you'll see that it doesn't show we're signed into our application anymore, right? So if I come back over to my text editor, the problem with this, doing this in this way, is that React really doesn't play well with DOM events, such as event listeners and things like that. Now, sometimes within React, it's required for things like scroll events or things like that. But in this case, we need to refactor this code to handle this within the Redux Saga library. And this is, again, one of the benefits of using Redux Saga. It will help us persist the user's auth status throughout our application, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the contents of this use effect hook. I'm going to cut that out, and we'll return to clean up this component a bit later. But I'm going to move that code inside of my user Saga, and I'm actually going to create a helper generator function. Yes, you can do that. And I'm going to create that just at the top of the file. And the reason I'm not going to just put this code into this function here is because I already know I need this for some of my other sagas. So I'm going to create this as a helper function that other functions can use. And I'm just going to say that this is get snapshot from user auth. And what we're going to do is we're just going to create a try catch here, and we'll catch an error which we can log out. So console.log the error. We'll comment that out for now, and I'm just going to paste this code in here. So currently this line here, let's remove this part here. But what we're doing is we're effectively subscribing to the user's auth status. Whenever the user's auth status changes within our application, so if they're signed in, their auth status has changed. They're now signed in. It reruns this block of code. That's what it was doing before. And what it actually gets from the Firebase library is this user auth object. Well, the way that we can get this is when we actually sign the user in here within our email sign-in generator function here, we can actually get this, destructure this off of the response it returns. And this will be returned as the user. So what we can actually do here is just yield, and we can call this get snapshot from user auth helper function that we have created, and just pass it the user. Okay, and when we do that, we can receive it here. We no longer need to worry about user auth because we are now getting it. So we can get rid of that, and we can get rid of the if statement. We also don't need this dispatch here, and this closing function here, we can get rid of that too. So we already have the user. But what is this handle user profile function? What is this? So to understand that, we need to look at what that is. So this is coming from our Firebase utility file. So let's head over to that file and look at that function. So again, this is a helper function we created in one of the first videos of this series. And this basically just checks if the user that has signed in is stored in our users collection on our Firebase database. And if they're not, so you can see here, if they don't exist, it basically sets them, it adds them to our Firebase collection, our database of our users. So it basically registers them. The only difference and change we'll have to make here is this will now be sent as an object, right? And I'll explain why that is in just a second. So we'll need to make that small change. But the other thing to note here is that after it has signed them, it has registered the user, it will return the user ref. And this is what we actually use to update the Redux store with the user's information, because this object contains things like the user's display name and things like that, which we use in our application. So let's return to the file here. And the problem is, again, we can't use this await keyword. This is a generator function, so we say yield, but we also cannot call a function in this way, right? So what we need to do is, rather than that, we use an effect from Redux Saga. We call it like this. So we first of all, we pass the function we want to call, which is this handle user profile. And the second thing we're going to do is pass it an object, and the object will just contain what this function expects to receive. So again, if we look at this, it expects the user auth and any additional data we want to pass. We don't want to pass any additional data in this case, but what we do want to pass is the user auth, and we're going to pass it the user that we get back here when we sign them in. And that's all we need to do for this line. But then what we want to do is effectively handle storing that, updating our Redux store with the user's information. To do that, we need to actually get the snapshot of this user. So to do that, we'll just create a const called snapshot, which will yield the user ref, which we again get back from this handle user profile function, and then we'll just call get on that, and that will return the snapshot that we require. So we again can get rid of this line here, and all that now remains is to dispatch our success event, which is our success action here. So we're not going to use this set current user anymore. We want to dispatch our success event. So to do that, all we need to do is again move the code we wrote here, which dispatches the success event. We want to move that out, and we want to add it here, uncommented, and all this will expect is an object with this information that we were previously passing to set current user. And again, we can now delete this line here. And again, this shouldn't have a semicolon. We can add that here. Now, although we're currently dispatching this sign in success event here within our generator function, which would sign the user in and update the Redux store, our reducer is not set up to handle this case, right? So if we look at this action, it dispatches the sign in success type. Now, if we look at our user reducer, we have quite a lot of code in here, but none of it is set up to handle the changes that we've made. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a major refactor, which is going to be more deleting than anything else. And all we're going to do currently is just delete the initial state all apart from the current user. And we're going to delete all the cases off of our switch function apart from the default case. We want to define a new case, which will be based off of user types dot success user types dot sign in success, which will return an object with the state, and we're going to set the current user to be the action dot payload. Right? That's all you need to do. Once you've done that, you can save those changes, and we can come back over to the browser at this point, and we can sign into the application. So we'll say Joe logs at Outlook, which is again the test account. Enter the password and click login, and we'll be signed into the application. But you'll notice we were not redirected. We were signed in, our header updated, but we weren't redirected. So if we come back over to the code and figure out why, well, the reason is in our actual sign-in component, we are getting the sign-in success value from the Redux store and using that in our useEffect hook here, right? Which of course doesn't exist. We removed that. So now what we're going to do is in our map state function, we're going to map the current user, and we'll say user.currentUser. We are going to destructure that from our Redux store, and we'll use that in our useEffect hook to determine when we should redirect the user to the home page when the user is signed in. We also don't need to dispatch this. So Now let's save that and come back over to the browser. And what we'll do here is we'll just sign in again and see what happens. So we'll say Joe Blogs at outlook.com, and we'll enter the password as usual, log in, and you'll see now that the header's updated. I'm redirected to the home page as I was before, and that's fine. Now there's one last thing we need to cover, and that's if I do a reload of this page. And if I do that, you'll see that I'm kind of signed out. I'm actually still logged in, right? But in actuality, the website and application doesn't reflect the fact that I am still logged in. Even though I know I didn't log out, the session is still there. So as you guys know, earlier in this tutorial, we removed the code that runs in this useEffect hook that would check the user's auth status whenever this component mounts, whenever we basically run our application. And because of that, whenever the user goes away from the website and returns to our website, or whenever they reload a page in their web browser, we are unable to persist the user's current session. So what we actually need to do is, although we can't do it the way we did before, we need to find a way to persist the user's auth status within this application. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to create another action, which we're going to do in our user actions file. We'll say export const, and we're just going to call this check user session, which is just going to return a function with a type which we haven't defined yet. So we're going to create another type, which is just going to be check user session. And again, the value will be the same as the name of the key, like that. So in our user action here, the type will be user types dot check user session. And then we need to create the equivalent saga. So let's come over to our user sagas. I'm just going to collapse these two functions here so we have a bit more, we can see things a little bit easier. And we're just going to say export function. It's a generator function, so we need to remember the asterisk here. And we'll just say on check user session, and we'll just yield take latest, and we'll pass it the action we're listening for, which is user types dot check user session, and then we need to pass it the generator function that will handle this check, and we're going to call that is user authenticated. So we'll say export here, again function is user authenticated. And we're going to write that code out in a second, but we need to pass this first of all as the second argument here, as that's what take latest expects. And then what we need to do is very similar to what we do here when we sign in the user. All right, so what we need to do is we need a way of finding out if the user is currently signed into our application. And in actuality, there really isn't a good way of doing that without using that same on-auth state changed method that we were previously using from the Firebase auth library itself. But we're going to interact with that a little bit differently. So actually what we need to do is we need to come over to our Firebase utility file, and we need to create another helper function, right? And what we're going to call this function here, so we're just going to say export const, and it's going to be get current user, because we're going to use this to find out if the current user is signed into our application or not. Now to do this without an event listener, we're going to have to resolve a promise. So to do that, this function is just going to return a new promise. So we'll need to pass in the resolve and reject. And then we're going to basically create unsubscribe, which will equal our auth library on auth state changed, which is going to receive the user auth object, which could be null if the user is not signed in. And then we're going to unsubscribe here by just calling this function, because if you remembered from earlier videos when I've talked about this on auth state changed method, it returns a function which we can use to unsubscribe, and that's how we're going to unsubscribe here too. And then we can immediately resolve the promise once we have the value of user auth. That tells us if the user is signed into our application or not. And just as a fallback, we can also reject here. Okay, so that looks good. And what we're going to do now is come back over to our user saga, specifically our isUserAuthenticated generator function. And we're going to use it here. So up here where we import helper functions from our Firebase utils file, I'm going to import that getCurrentUser helper function I just created. And within my isUserAuthenticated generator function, what we're going to do here is we're going to have another try catch. So we'll have a try catch here. We'll catch any errors. We'll log them out if we have them. But we'll do that when we're debugging. So for now, I'll just comment that out. And the first thing we want to do is we want to get back that user auth object, right? Which again is here. So this is getCurrentUser, and it returns that user auth object. So what we want to do here is we want to get that user auth. So we'll say const user auth equal, I'll say yield, and we'll just call getCurrentUser here. Now, if the user doesn't exist, so user auth here is null, right? Then we'll just immediately return out of this function because we don't want to do anything else. The user is not signed into our application. Because again, if we look at that helper function, what we're doing is we're creating a promise. We're subscribing to onAuth status changed, onAuth state changed method from our auth library from Firebase, which returns the user's auth object, and this will return null if the user is not signed into the application, in which case we don't need to go any further. However, if they are signed into our application, then we want to restore our Redux store with the current user's information, which is exactly what we're doing here, right? With our get snapshot from user auth helper function that we created. So again, all we need to do here in this case, if we get past this check, is we need to yield get snapshot from user auth and just pass it user auth. Okay, so now that we've created our onCheck user session saga, we simply need to export it with our user sagas so that we can intercept that action. We'll do that by passing it to this array here of our user sagas. So I'll say comma all. So I'll say comma call and pass it my onCheck user session. And again, we only need to pass in this onCheck user session saga because this is where we define what the action we should be listening for, and this will call isUserAuthenticated for us. So we only need to pass in the single saga. But that's not all we need to do because we're not actually dispatching this event from app.js just yet. So let's come back over to app.js. Let's uncomment out this useEffect hook. We don't need to worry about returning anything here. We also still don't need any dependency. We do need to import our action here though. So we want to import check user session, and this is what we actually want to dispatch. So we'll just go ahead and dispatch that here when we mount. And then just as a nice cleanup here, let's just delete everything that we are not using. So we don't need redirect, and we don't need use selector anymore either. So that's all we need. We can just save those changes. Let's just quickly review the file. So it's a much simpler file now as well, which is really nice. And that's all. So now we're doing it. We can come back over to the browser. Okay, and now we're ready to actually test this out in the browser. So I'm going to go ahead and log into one of my test accounts. So it's Joe blogs at outlook.com. Sign in with my password and sign in. As you can see, I'm signed into the application. Can move around the site normally, and I can refresh the browser. And as you can see, I'm still logged into the application. So I'm now persisting the user's auth status successfully. But I want to talk to you about something that is not working, and that's how we are currently logging out of the application. So if I click on log out, you'll see that nothing happens because I'm not actually logged. I'm logged out of the application in the background, but I'm not updating the Redux store. So if I was to reload the browser, you'll see that the session is cleared because I'm no longer able to obviously access, I don't have the session, so it's not able to persist it. But of course that shouldn't happen. It should immediately log the user out and update the Redux store. So the first thing that we need to do is come over to types and create our types. So this is going to be sign out user start. Again, that takes the value of the name of the key. And then secondly, it will be sign out user success. And again, that will take the same value as the name of the key. We then need to come over to our actions over here. We need to create our action. So we'll say export const sign out user start equals a function. Just going to return an object with a type, which is going to equal the user types dot sign out user start. And then we need to create another action, which is const sign out user success, right? And this is where we will use this to update the Redux store once the user is signed out of our application using the Firebase auth library itself. And this is just going to have a type with user types dot sign out user success. So we now need to create our new sagas that will actually successfully sign out the user. So up here at the top, when we import our actions, we need to import another action, which is going to be sign out user success. And then we need to create our sagas that will handle signing out the user. So the first one we'll create, we'll just say export function. It's a generator function, so don't forget the asterisk. And we'll just say on sign out user start. And this will just yield take latest. We will pass it the action we want to intercept. So user types dot sign out user start, and then we pass it the generator function that will handle that. So we'll say export function. It's a generator function, and we'll just call this sign out user. We will write this in a second, but we just need to pass this here. And then finally, we also want to export this from with our user sagas. So here I'm going to call and pass our on sign out user start, and this is again how we will intercept that event when it is dispatched. So how do we sign out the user? So let's look at how we're doing it currently. To do that, we need to come over to our header, and in our header.js file we have our sign out button, And at the moment, it's very simple. We just call auth sign out, right? So it's pretty simple. So if I come back over to my Saga, in my sign out user generator function, I'm going to have a try catch. We're going to catch the errors, and we'll log out the error if there is one. But by default, we will not log that. We'll comment it out for now. And then all we want to do is yield auth dot sign out, right? Because that's what we were doing in our header.js files, just auth sign out like that. And then what we want to do is update the store. So we're going to call our sign out user success, and we're going to dispatch that action. To do that, we just say put, well, we'll say yield first. So yield put, and then we call sign out user success, and we don't need to pass it anything. That's just going to go ahead and update our Redux store. Now to do that, we need to come over now to our reducer, which will update the store. And what we want to do is we want to create a new case, which is going to be user types dot sign out user success, where we will return a new object with the state. We're going to pass it our initial state, which is going to set the current user to null and sign them out of our application. So what that means is when we come over here, all we need to do now is in our header, rather than calling auth sign out directly, we need to dispatch the action itself. So to do that, we need to import from React Redux, use dispatch, and at the top of the file we need access to dispatch. So I'm going to say const dispatch equals use dispatch. That gives us access to it. Up here we need to create a const, which will be sign out, right? It's just going to be a simple function here. And all we're going to do here is we're just going to dispatch our action. So we'll say dispatch here. We need to import our action. We don't have it yet. So here we're going to say import from our actions. So we'll say it's in Redux user actions, and it's something like sign out user start, right? So we just need to dispatch this action here, and then all we need to do is just call this when the user clicks on sign out. So currently it happens when the user clicks sign out, they go directly with auth sign out. Now we'll just call well, what did we call this? It's just sign out. So now we'll just call this function to dispatch the action that signs out the user. That also means that we don't need to import auth into this file anymore, because that's handled, that's decoupled away from that logic is now decoupled from this component. Okay, so let's now come back over to the browser and let's sign in again. So I'm just going to sign into that same test account. So joeblogs@outlook.com. Sign in with the password. I'm signed in. I'm redirected. I can go to my account, and now I can actually click on logout, and I'm logged out of the application. I can reload the page. I'm still logged out, so that's fantastic. So far in this tutorial, we've managed to refactor a significant portion of our code to work with Redux Saga. That includes the logout functionality, the sign out functionality, and also the ability to persist a user's auth status. And all of that is now being taken care of for us by Redux Saga, which is fantastic. And a lot of the foundation has been laid for us to actually continue refactoring this application to actually work with Redux Saga in regards to the flows that remain for us to look at, which includes registration and email password. So let's just go ahead, dive right in and refactor those. The first one I'm going to do is the registration flow. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is create our new action and types. So the only type that we need to create for this flow is going to be sign up user start, right? It's going to take the same value as the name of the key, like that. Let's come back over to our user actions and create our action. So in actuality, this is actually going to be very simple. It's just going to require export const sign up user start. Again, it's going to take the user credentials, and then it's going to simply return an action, a function that returns an action with an object, sorry, with a type, which is user types dot sign up user start with a payload of the user credentials, right? So now we're ready to go ahead and create our Redux Saga. So to do that, what we're going to need to do is just go ahead and enter here, create our first Saga for sign up. So we'll say export function, which is a generator function, and we'll just say on sign up user start, and we'll just say take latest. We'll pass it the action that we're going to be intercepting and listening for, which is going to be sign up user start, and then we'll pass in the generator function that will handle that. So in this case, it's just going to be export function, which is a generator function, sign up user, and we're going to return to this in just a second, but we need to pass that in here. And also, of course, we also need to pass it to where we export our sagas. So this is becoming quite a long line here. So I'm just going to move this onto separate lines so it's a little easier for us to see and work with. So here I'll just say call, and I'm going to add my on sign up user start saga. So we'll now be listening for that within our Redux store. Whenever this action is dispatched, we'll intercept it. We'll call this generator function that will handle signing up the user. Now again, this is going to receive the entire action, which means we can destructure off the payload, and we'll then be able to destructure things like the credentials that we need, which is going to include the display name, the email, password, and the confirmation password. And then what we can do is we can actually save ourselves a little bit of time by coming over to the user actions, and let's look for the previous action that we were using to sign up the user, which is right here, right? So sign up user. And let's just take the entire contents of this action, cut it, and let's come back over to our Saga and paste that in. And I'm going to go through the lines, and we're gonna refactor this so that it will work within our Redux Saga. So some of this is still the same. As you can see, we have this password error here, which basically checks that the password matches the confirmation password and allows us to render an error if they don't match. So again, here we are dispatching another event, which is an error event. Here we actually need to think about how we're going to handle this, because we don't actually currently have a errors a errors action that we can dispatch. So I'm going to comment this out for now, and I'm going to come back over to my user types, and I'm going to create a new action, which is going to be called user error, right? Again, it's going to take the same value as the name of the key. We're going to come over to our action, which is right here. And at the top of the file here, under sign up user start, I'm going to export const user error. And that's going to take an error and return an object, call a function that returns an object with a type of user types dot user error and a payload of the error. Okay, and what we'll then do is on our reducer, we're going to have a new piece of state, which is going to be user errors, which by default is just going to be an empty array. We'll then add a new case to the reducer here. So we'll say case user types dot user error, and we will return the state, but we will set the user error state to be the action dot payload. Okay. Now, when the user manages to successfully sign in, we will want to restore this, right? Because they've successfully signed in, so the errors no longer exist. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set the user error back to an empty array in this case. Okay, so now what we can do is come back over to our Saga, and where we were previously dispatching this event like this, we can come back to the top of the file and import a new action, which is going to be user error, user auth, so our user error action, which we created before. And all that does is it expects an error. So here, what we're going to do, and actually I also just noticed I was expecting confirmation password. It's actually just confirm password. And what we want to do here is we're going to say yield put, and we are going to dispatch that directly. So we'll just say user error, and we're just going to pass in here, and we're just going to pass in the error here, so we can then remove that, and we can remove this return. And finally, we just need to refactor the code within our try catch that actually handles signing up the user. There's not much that we need to change here. We just need to change this await keyword to yield. We still want to return the destructure the user off of the response object. But then what we're going to do is we're going to say yield rather than this await keyword here. And remember, we can't call this handle user profile the same way as we did before. We need to call it with the call effect. We can then pass in handle user profile, but we call it by passing in the function we want to call, and then we need to pass it this data as an object. These are what will be passed to the handle user profile function, but we need to pass the user as the user auth, and we need to pass the display name as an object to additional data, which again, if we check this, it expects this additional data object if there is one, if there is any, sorry. So that's going to be an object there. We don't need this closing bracket here. And finally, we don't need to dispatch anything here at all. And that's actually all we need to do to refactor the asynchronous code for signing up the user. The only difference now is actually going to be on the component level. So let's come back over to our registration component. So we have our sign up component and index. And we have this, a few things here. So currently we're looking at sign up success. We want to switch that to look for current user. So where we map our state here, we want to map two things. Okay, so the first thing we want to look for is going to be the current user, which we can get off of user current user. And then the second, if I just check the reducer, what we're checking for is the user error array. So what we'll do is we'll come to, again, our sign up component, and we will get that from our user state. And again, we want to get both of those from our Redux store here. So we'll get the current user and the user error array. And the first thing we'll do is on this use effect hook, we're checking if the user has successfully signed up. If they are, we're redirecting them away. We are now using the current user object directly to do that. So we'll pass that in as the dependency for rerunning this code. And also that will be the condition that needs to match in order to redirect the user. We also don't need to dispatch this anymore, so we can get rid of that. And we can also remove the import for that action. We're not using that anymore. And also the sign up user action, we're not using that. We're now using the sign up user start action. So actually within our handle submit function, where we were previously firing sign up user, we're now firing sign up user start. But again, this object of the user's credentials remains the same. And then finally, this is where we handle the actual user's errors. So where we have this user error array here, we want to update the array that we are passing here. And that's all the changes that we need to make to this component. Okay, so we're finally ready to test this out in the browser. So let's go ahead and do a sign up. So I'm just going to say here, example full name, example email.com, enter a password. First of all, one that does not match, so we should get an error. Okay, so I'm not getting, so this doesn't seem to be working, so let me just check the code. So on sign up user start, we forgot to, or I forgot, the yield keyword here. That's very important. All right, guys, so what I actually just did was I realized I made a mistake. And as you can see, nothing is happening when I click register, which is a little bit deceptive because what's actually happened in the background is I have successfully been signed up. I'm just not reflecting that in the application, right? So if I come over to inspect, what you'll see is that if I click on register again, I get this error which I'm logging out in the background, which says the email address is already used by another account. And the reason is that I've clicked this multiple times. So if I was to change this email to 123, this doesn't exist, right? So if I now register, you'll see nothing happens. I don't get an error. But if I click this again, I now do get an error, which basically says that the email address is now already used by another account, right? So obviously, what that means is that I'm simply not, when I'm successfully signing up, I'm not redirecting the user. And the reason is, if I come back over to the code, is when I refactored this logic, I just refactored this line here, which we're using to handle the user profile right here, right? So what I actually did was I actually created a helper function, which was this get snapshot from user auth, which will actually handle this for me, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little refactor on this. And what I want to do is, rather than call this directly, I'm going to do the same thing I did with email sign-in, which is I pass the user directly to this helper function that will handle this for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment this line out for now. I'm going to say yield, and what I want to do is I'm going to say get snapshot from user auth, and I'm going to pass it the user, and I'm also going to pass it the additional data, which I'm going to define as a constant above, right? And I'm going to pass that in as the second argument to this helper function. So I now have this additional data. So if I now come back over to my helper function, I'm going to pass this in here. I'm going to default the value to an empty object. And I'm going to pass that in to my helper function. Now that's really good, but there's another thing that's really important that I missed as well, which is here. When we actually check if the password and confirm password match, we also need to make sure that we return here, because that will basically that means that if this does throw an error, we'll dispatch the action to render the error to the user, but we then need to make sure we return immediately out of this function and that we don't proceed to try and sign up. So this is a very important line here that you guys need to make sure you add that in. And again, this is a long tutorial, so yeah, it's a lot of refactoring going on here. So apologies for missing that, but maybe you guys spotted that, and if you spotted that before, then well done. But make sure to add in this return here. It's very important. Okay, so let's finally come back over to the browser and let's test this out. So let's go to the registration page. Let's do another full name. Example at test.com. Enter a password. First of all, let's enter a password that does not match. So you can see we render the error. Now let's make sure the passwords match and try and register. And I'm also redirected. I'm logged in. I'm signed up. And that's it. We've successfully refactored our registration route. The next form and component we need to look at is our email password form. And this is the last form that we need to refactor to complete the integration of Redux Saga into our application. So the first thing we need to do is just head over to our text editor and create our types. So I'm going to come into the Redux folder user, open up my actions file and my types file, and let's create our types. So the types I need to create off the top of my head initially are going to be reset password start, and of course the corresponding success type. So reset password success, and we're going to assign both of those the values, which is going to be the name of the key itself. We can then come over to our actions file and just create the corresponding actions. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So we'll say export const reset password start, and that is going to take the user credentials, return a function with a payload. The type is just going to be user types dot reset reset password start, and the payload is going to be the user's credentials. And the second action we need to create will say export const reset password success. We're not going to pass anything in here, but it will be a function that returns an object with a type, which is going to be user types dot reset password success, and the payload here is going to be true. So what we want to do here is now come over to our user sagas file, and we need to create our saga. So at the top of this file, we need to import the action that we want to dispatch on the success event, which is going to be called the reset password success action we just created. And if we come down to the bottom of the file, this is where I'm going to create my new sagas. So we're going to create our first generator function. So we'll say export function. Using the function keyword followed by an asterisk, we can create a generator function. And we'll say on reset password start, right? And then we'll say yield take latest. It expects two things. Firstly, the type we're listening for, which is going to be reset password start. And the second is the name of the generator function that will handle this asynchronous code. So we'll have to create that. So export function, it's a generator function. We'll just call this reset password. And this is going to receive the entire action. So we can destructure off the payload, and then we can destructure the email from the payload. And what we want to do is then pass reset password in to take latest, because that's the function that will be called when it intercepts this action. We then need to make sure that we export this at the bottom of the file. So we'll say call on reset password start. And then finally, we're ready to come over and grab the code from our actions file. So if you remember, we are refactoring this from what was previously just a simple action. So this was our reset password action that we were using before to handle this, to handle resetting the user's password and sending the password reset email. I'm going to take the entire contents of this action and I'm going to paste it into my generator function. But this is actually going to require a little bit more refactoring than what we've done previously. The reason is that we're using this then and .catch callback events, which we can't do within our generator function. So what we can do is we can move this into a helper function. So within my user folder, I'm going to create another file called user.helpers.js, and I'm going to have to import my auth library from my utility function, my utilities file. So let's come back and import. So it's Firebase /utils. We'll need to import our auth library, and then I can create that. I can move that code into this. So I'm going to just call this, I'll say export const, and I'll say handle reset password API, right? And this is just going to take the user's email and what we want to do is we want to return a new promise. And obviously this is going to allow us to either resolve or reject And what we need to do is come back over into our Saga where we pasted this code. We'll cut that, and we'll come back over to our helper function and paste that in. We can remove the await keyword. And much of this is going to remain the same. We also need this const where we configured the return URL. So I'll just paste that above, which we're using here. We're already getting the user's email. But rather than trying to dispatch events in these cases, what I'm actually going to do is if we enter the success callback, I will resolve this promise, and if there is an error, I'm going to throw the error using reject. And once I've done that, what I can then do is come back over into my Saga, and we'll need to import that helper function from the top of the file. So up here, we're going to import that from our user helpers file. So it's handle reset password API. And within our generator function, we are simply just going to have our try catch, right? But what we'll do is we'll say yield we'll call our handle reset password API, and we'll pass it our email. And what yield will do is that it will allow us to await our promise to resolve. So if you remember, again, our helper function, we're returning a promise. So it's going to wait for this to either resolve or throw an error. Now, if we throw an error from within our promise, then because we have this in a try catch, we can throw the error. So we can either dispatch a success event, which I'll do here using the put effect. So I've already imported that at the top of the file, so it's reset password success. So I'll just call that here. But if I want to throw an error, then if we look at our helper function, I'm already passing the error here, which is an array with a string. So all I have to do is, again, say yield put, and I'm going to use this user, let's just check what it's called, the user error action, right? And I'm going to dispatch the user error action and pass the error array that we have caught in the try catch. Okay, now there's one thing we need to do on our reducer. So let's come over to our reducer, and we need to create some new initial state, which is going to be reset password success. By default, it's going to be false. So we'll have another case within our reducer here. We will say case user types dot reset password success, and in this case we will simply return an object with the state, but we'll change this so it will be reset password success, and this will be changed to the action dot payload. And then what we can do is come over to our component, our email password component, and we'll need to refactor this a little bit. So what we actually need to do now is dispatch the new action that we created, which is our reset password start action. So we'll say we'll import reset password start from our actions file. And where we dispatch that, so if we look at our form, on submit we call handle submit, and we dispatch this action. So we now need to dispatch reset password start, and we're still going to pass in our email. That's the same. But what we then need to do is think about how we handle success in our error events. So currently we are getting two So what we need to do is we need to get first of all, if we look at our reducer, the two relevant pieces of state that we need is the reset password success and the user error array, right? So let's come back over to our component, and we need to update our map state function. So the two things we need is the reset password success. We can get that from the user.reset password success. We also need user error, which is going to be from user.user error. And then we can get both of those from our Redux store using our useSelector hook, where we pass in our map state function. So we can then destructure that, so we can get reset password success and the user error array. And then within our useEffect hooks, we are already listening for changes in the reset password success state, and then we are dispatching this event. We don't need to do that right now, but what we are going to do is continue to just redirect the user. And here we have our useEffect hook here, where we're listening for the errors. So rather than listening for reset password errors, we're now going to listen to changes to the user error array. And then if that is true, then we'll update our errors, a local errors array, with the contents of our user error array that we're getting back from our Redux store. Cool. So let's save those changes and head back over to the web browser. I'm just going to reload this a few times. First of all, let's enter a random email that does not exist in our database. So I'll just say example@mydomain.com. And as you can see, I'm rendering the same error message to the user. And if I enter a valid email, so for example, joeblogs@outlook.com, and click on email password, I'm redirected to the login page, and the email would have been sent. But what happens if I try and click on reset password? Well, I can't access this. But what you will notice is that if I reload the page, I can then visit the page. I can get back to the email password page. The reason that this is happening is because in my code, I have this useEffect hook, which runs when the component is mounted, and it also runs whenever it detects a change in the reset password success state that we're getting from our Redux store. And this is what we're using to, whenever this code runs, we are dispatching this event from our user Saga as the success event, which in our reducer sets our reset password success. It sets it to true, right? And the problem is that because our state in the Redux store is persisted, they're unable, every time they try and navigate back to our email password page, this code runs, and because it is true, which is what we're evaluating for, they're immediately redirected back to the login page. So what we need to do is we need an additional way of resetting our user state, whenever they have successfully requested the email password. Whenever they've requested their password to be reset, that will reset the state in our Redux store so that they can access this page again. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come over to my user actions file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new action. And I'm just going to call this reset user state, right? It's not going to expect anything. It's just going to be a function that returns an object with a type. And of course, we need to define that type. So in my user types file, I'm going to create a new type, which is just going to be reset user state. Again, it's just going to have a string value with the name of the key. we'll then be able to come over to our user actions file. We'll say user types dot reset user state, right? And then what we'll be able to do is in my email password component, I'm going to import that new action, which is reset user state, and then we can dispatch that. At the same time, just before we redirect the user, we'll call dispatch, and we will dispatch our reset user state, right? So we can then save that. And now if I come back to my reducer, we already have a case where we're restoring the initial state, right? Which will reset all of our state. And so what we want to do is we want to stack this, right? So we'll create an additional case here. So we'll say on this case, which is user types dot reset user state, and we'll save that. And because we've stacked it, that's absolutely fine. It's not going to be an issue. This is one way of doing it. But because we're resetting it, I think this should probably come at the very bottom of our reducer, like that. So I'm just going to move that down to the bottom, because this is for sign out and reset. We just restore the state. So now if I come back to the browser, and let's test this. So refresh it and let's try. So let's enter a valid email. So joeblogs@outlook.com, email password. And now let's try and reset the password again. We can access this page without any problems. Okay, so at this point, we only have two things left to do. One is we need to think about how we can refactor our sign-in with Google to integrate that with Redux Saga. And the second thing that we need to do is we need to figure out just go through the application and remove any of the old code that we have that we're not using anymore, right? So let's start off with our Google sign-in, and this is going to be really easy because we've already done a lot of the groundwork. So I'm just going to go into my text editor, and I'm going to go into, again, the Redux folder, the types file, and I'm going to create my types. So the first type I'm going to create is Google sign in start. And what I want to do is just assign that the same value as the name of the key. We'll save it. And then all we need to do is go over to our actions file and create our action. So all this is going to be is export const Google sign in start, right? And we're not going to pass anything in here. It's just going to be an action that returns an object with a type, which is going to be user types dot Google sign in start. There's not going to be any payload. And then we need to come over to our user sagas file, and we're going to create our saga. So we'll just say export. It's a generator function, and we'll say on Google sign in start, and we will yield take latest user types dot Google sign in start. We need to pass that the generator function that is going to handle this event, the asynchronous code. So we'll say export function Google sign in. Again, we don't need to pass anything in. It's going to receive the entire action, but that actually doesn't have a payload, so we don't need to worry about that. We're going to pass that into our take latest effect, and then we can remember to export this with the other sagas in the file. Okay, so we're now ready to copy in the code from our previous action. So let's come down and find that. So this is our Google sign-in. This is our try catch. We're just going to take this code and put that into our Saga. Now, it's pretty simple what we have to do here. So rather than awaiting this, our auth sign-in with pop-up, what we're going to do is we're going to destructure from the response the user. We can then remove all of this code here, and also we need to remember here that we need to add the yield keyword here, which is going to mean that we wait for this to this promise to resolve, basically. Then what we can do is the same thing that we did with our sign-in. So let's come up here and look at our sign-in Saga. So we have, where is that? It's at the very top of the file, email sign-in. We created a helper function, which was get snapshot from user auth. So I'm just going to take this code, come back down here, and paste this line in. So we're getting the user back, we're passing that in, that's the user auth object. And again, let's just remind ourselves what we're doing. So this function is at the top of the file, and all it does is it just takes that user and it just basically uses our utility function to sign the user in and update our Redux store. So let's come back over to the, so what we need to do is make sure we're dispatching that the right action from our component. So what we need to do is come back over to our component and our sign in component. And as you can see here, we're dispatching our sign in with Google here. So what we need to do is, rather than import that from our actions file, we can remove both of these, and we're just going to import our the name of the action, which is, we just need to import Google sign in start. We'll import that action, and then in our handle Google sign in function here, where we dispatch this, we'll update that to call the correct action, which we can then save. And then what we need to do is just come back over to the browser and test it out. So let's refresh this a couple of times, click on sign in with Google. We're going to get our pop-up. I'm going to select my account, and I am logged into the application. I can view my account as normal, and I can log out just the same, right? So that's working. It's really easy to do. Now, the reason that was so easy is because we've already written the code for this earlier in this tutorial. It's very, very similar to our sign-in logic. We already created the helper functions that meant we can share the code between these two events, and they work exactly the same way. So we don't need to worry about that at all. Okay, so at this point, all I need to do is just go through and clean up the code. So what I'm going to do first of all is come over to my user folder and go into my actions folder. And we're not using any of these imports here at the top of the file, so I'm going to remove those. I'm going to come down. These are all of our old actions, the remnants of our older actions that we're not using anymore, so I'm going to delete all of those. Just make sure you don't delete any of the ones we've written in this tutorial. Let's save it. Let's just go through the files one by one. So this is our reducer. I think everything in here looks good. This is our user sagas file. Yep, this is all good. Our types, we can remove all of these old types that we're not using anymore. That actually feels really good to delete those. So that's great. Let's also just come over to our components and let's just check those one by one. So we're not importing anything that we don't want to use. That looks good. Our sign-in component. And I'm just checking that we're not importing anything that we're not using anymore. And yeah, everything looks pretty good right now. As a bit of bonus content to this tutorial, what I want to do is leave you with a parting gift, which is just a really small refactor to our components around how we're currently redirecting the user on success events. So this affects the following components. It affects our sign up component, our sign in component, and our email password component. So currently what we're doing is within this use effect hook, we're checking for whenever the success event occurs. So whenever they successfully reset their password, what we're doing is we're accessing the history from props and we're pushing them to the login route. We're doing the same thing on sign in and sign up too. But it's basically the way that we're currently getting access to history. If we actually look at how we're doing this, what we're doing is we're importing with router from React Router DOM, and then where we export our component, which is email password in this case, we're wrapping it with router, and that's how we gain access to history within the props of our component. However, this is the old way of doing this, as if you are working with a stateful component, a class-based component. And obviously now we are using React hooks, so we're going to do this differently. So what I want to do is, rather than using with router, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply export my component. But to gain access to history, where we previously imported with router from React Router DOM, I'm now going to import use history, which is a hook from React Router DOM, which works very nicely with React hooks. And to access that, all I need to do at the top of my function of my component, I'm going to create a const called history, which is going to equal use history, which I need to call as a function. And I'm actually going to move up my dispatch where I define dispatch here. And then all I have to do is, where I want to redirect the user, I'll just simply say history.push, so we can get rid of props. And that's all you need to do to use the use history hook. So we need to replicate that change in our sign in and sign up. So where I was previously importing with router, I'll now import use history. We can get rid of the props keyword here. We're not using it. We can come down here and just remove with router. We're not using that anymore. Cool. Let's do the same thing on our sign up component. So rather than with router, it's now use history. And we want to as well we'll need to remember to create that instance. So we'll say const history equals use history, call that as a function. And in here, we'll say const history equals use history, call that as a function. Remove the props keyword here. Let's come down and remove with router. And that's all you need to do. We're now using the use history hook instead of with router. And let's test that on the browser as well. So I'm just going to come over here and just use one of the forms. So let's use our login component, log into a test account. So Joe blogs at outlook.com and sign in. And as you can see, I'm still redirected just as I was before, but we're now using the use history hook. And that brings us to the end of this video tutorial, where I just want to remind you guys that at the end of each of these videos, I am creating PRs, and I am merging with my code with master. So again, if you guys want to check out the code that I'm writing in these tutorials, I encourage you guys to check out the official repository for this project. You can find a link to that either in the description of this video, or you can visit my GitHub page, which is github.com/simpletut, and you can actually look at the code that I've written. You can compare the code. But of course, I also just want to congratulate you for making it to the end of this tutorial. It definitely was probably the most difficult tutorial that we've done so far in this series. So really congratulations to you for making it this far, and also thank you for supporting this series and watching it. But that is it for this tutorial. So again, thank you, and I look forward to catching you again in the next episode.